Sibelius 7 features a completely upgraded set of sounds, promoted as professional quality, but how well do those sounds work as a virtual orchestra? Hey there, this is Thomas Goss with the second video in a main series of 3 covering the massive upgrade of Sibelius 7. I originally intended for this video to include an in-depth look at all the orchestral sound patches, but the script just got to be too long for one video. So I have released my sound set reviews as separate videos, which I recommend you view first. And if you haven't seen it, you may also want to watch my first main Sibelius 7 review, which features a more general overview of the changes in the look and feel of the program, to help you understand the context of some of my comments here. The third video, coming up in a few days, will have my thoughts and recommendations for the developers of Sibelius on how to improve the program from my viewpoint as a professional composer and orchestrator. But sounds are just sounds. The more important question, after you've had a listen to the new patches, is how do they perform as a virtual orchestra? How does the new playback architecture work in Sibelius 7, and what are its limitations? Will it help composers and orchestrators in training to make better decisions about how to finalize their scores for a live performance? Those were the big questions that I had when I read the promotional material for the new upgrade, and I hope to provide some answers now after having thoroughly analyzed the individual sounds. I've been purchasing various samplers, modules, and sound sets for my whole career, for use in various projects and demos. I'll never forget my conversation with the EMU rep at a music store demo of the Proteus 2 module. He activated the onboard demo, a very flashy, faux cinematic collection of cliches designed to illustrate the strengths of the new gear. Those sounds are pretty Stone Age by today's standards, but they weren't bad for the year 1990 if you were a young commercial composer and producer. I asked the rep if there was also a demo of some traditional orchestral repertoire like Debussy or Tchaikovsky. His answer was unforgettable. Why would anybody want to hear that? He wasn't being scornful, he just honestly could not see why any pro orchestrator would care. When I explained to him that it would show classically trained musicians the Proteus 2's scope for real orchestral composition, he just shook his head. But here's the truth as I see it. Late Romantic period music is the acid test for any sound set. It contains the germ of cinematic orchestration with broad emotional gestures, and yet has variety of tone and function that challenges the flexibility of any type of performance, live or digital. It also relies heavily on naturalistic, thematic-based phrasing for the strings and winds. It avoids more modern elements of ambience or motoristic rhythm, which can disguise a sound set's limitations. But the biggest advantage to testing VSTs with a romantic score is that you can immediately hear if there is an overall problem and why. The structure of the music is extremely clear, like a pane of glass, and it's easy to see the smudges, scratches, and squashed bugs. Next to the sweep of a Tchaikovsky symphony, the Proteus 2 demo sounds dinky, and so do many other demos since then for the steadily improving field of VSTs. When Sibelius instituted Playback back in version 2, it automatically exposed the program to the whole digital music industry pressure for more realism and better sounds. But Sibelius really hasn't been able to cope with those demands until this version's upgrade, radically changing and improving the way a note gets played when you hit the start button. As I mentioned in the first video, Sibelius 7 has replaced all of its menus and its properties panel with an overhead ribbon. While for some functions, this will have a lot of us longtime users hunting around, in the case of the play ribbon, it makes perfect sense to have all these controls spread out nicely on one strip. Now you can easily activate the video controls, edit hit points, and open the dictionary from one panel, instead of having to scroll through menus. I found this much easier to work with, and I'm guessing it would be even more welcoming to an entry-level user. The real heart of the playback system is the mixer, which now pops up from the bottom of the window and is detachable if you're working with different screens. The basic layout starts with faders at the bottom, but can be increased at a click to include a row of pan pots, solo and mute buttons, and effects trim faders. One more click expands the mixture to include patch and effects assign readouts, and yet another reveals the reverb and chorus faders. Buttons on the left show or hide volume and effects strips, including a very useful group strip governing the balance of different sections of the orchestra: winds, strings, brass, percussion, and keyboards. I like this feature a lot, as it's useful when mixing a mock-up for an audio project. The only drawback I see so far is that the harp is included under the keyboard group strip, making things complicated if you were orchestrating in an early 20th century style, like, say, Petrushka or Nights in the Gardens of Spain. This should be changed. There are a lot of automated features that will save a lot of time and help less experienced composers and audio techs. Whenever you select a template score, or select individual instruments, Sibelius will automatically set up a virtual instrument and place it in a logical stereo position. This works most effectively with big orchestral groups and is based on typical seating layouts. The designers have called this new feature Sound Stage, and I have to say that it does add a more natural sound to the score when you're listening with excellent stereo separation and amplification. Overall, in this new revision, there's been a lot of care devoted to trying to help Sibelius users in this regard. There are even some tips presented in the reference manual about how to avoid an organ-like sound. While it's true that balance, expression, and panning do play a part in this unpleasant audio phenomenon, I would say that the biggest culprit is something that they missed, which is very difficult to fix: the complementary resonance of overtones in different patches coming together. That is how the unique sound of pipe organs is achieved, after all, with many pipes of different timbres interacting on the same pitch. Of course, you can always choose a different patch, and Sibelius has quite a variety of sounds, often with different variations on the same sound. To refine this even further, many patches have smart knobs, little dials that can adjust different elements like attack, release, and timbre. This is just brilliant, and I love it, though I can barely read those tiny words. Rest assured, though, if you prefer your East-West Quantum Leap sound library, or want to create a mixture of different sound libraries for the ultimate personal orchestra, you can easily set up your own configuration, or even several different configurations for different projects. I felt the new layouts for playback functions and mixer were very intuitive. As a busy composer who is very focused on notation and working with live performers, I don't always have the time and the motivation to learn complex MIDI procedures and setups. This new user interface, at least for playback, is the most simple and elegant that Sibelius has ever been. Well, if you've heard the sounds and watched the reviews, then you're ready. Let's test the sounds in the playback interface with 3 excerpts from Tchaikovsky's 6th Symphony. Let's analyze that sample, using the elements of texture, balance, and function. In terms of balance, what's interesting here is that I used Tchaikovsky's own detailed dynamics for the most part, only tweaking a bit here and there, and avoided adjusting the faders on the mixer. The result was not too bad in terms of balance, though in a real orchestral situation, the winds and horns would probably play down a notch on those repeated chords. The same goes for the timpani. As far as texture is concerned, though I think the meaning of the music came across pretty well for a demo, the sense of realism was challenged by coarseness in the brass, lack of vibrato in the strings, and nasal-sounding winds. Still, the overall texture presented a good blend of basic tonalities, never quite overpowered by one timbre or another. Finally, the functionality of the lines were decent, but limited by problems of articulation and phrasing that are built into the sounds of the playback architecture. It goes beyond Sibelius's current abilities, along with pretty much every other sequence-based playback, to smoothly phrase a swooping line on strings. The regularity of individual notes results in a robotic-sounding phrase, and that's also a problem in the repeated wind and horn chords. Instead of floating like clouds over the golden melody of the strings, the chords bounce clumsily. Still, I liked how the music seemed to humanize when the tempo fluctuated. Now let's try out a more delicate yet up-tempo bit of Tchaikovsky scoring, the opening of the Sixth Symphony's second movement. For this sample, I adjusted the levels in the mixer window, not unlike how a conductor might balance the sections in rehearsal, with the brass and winds down a bit, and the strings brought forward as much as possible. Let's see how that works. This movement is mostly composed of a series of 8-bar episodes, so let's analyze it section by section. As you probably noticed at the start, the cello melody could have been much more resonant and legato, though the supporting instruments were nicely placed. In the second section, the 3-octave wind melody was a bit more convincing in its legato, though the reedy sounds of clarinet and oboe overwhelmed the flutes on top. Following this, the strings come back with one of those classic Tchaikovsky chord melodies, and here I thought the whole group performed well, especially the accompanying winds and horns, and the bass trombone giving some solidity to the double basses. For the next 2 episodes, the winds dominate, first as a chorale and then as a section octave melody. I felt in both cases the very reedy sound of the clarinet was overdone, and made the music sound accordion-like. But from there on, the music suddenly became very clear and well-balanced across the spectrum, with the textures of different functions standing out clearly or supporting each other cleanly. It made me want to keep scoring to see how the rest of the movement would turn out. Let's really challenge Sibelius' capabilities now with the last 32 bars of the third movement, a rousing finale that's nearly all triple F. into the limitations of Sibelius playback. While you can adjust the response of the playback with various smart knob settings, dynamic markings, articulations, and alternate patches, when it all comes down to it, it's a very plain and simple sequencer, not a DAW. While there was a lot to commend there in the last test, like that nice crescendo and the solidity of the brass, the atmosphere was more of the circus than the concert hall. I don't think it's even worth bothering going into a detailed analysis. It's plain that in a finale of this type, the shortcomings of the new playback system all collide and show things at their worst. There really isn't any way to make the kind of conclusive ratings on the Tchaikovsky test that I did for the sound sets. It's not the sort of test that a VST system can categorically pass or fail. I would say that the level of reality depends on whether the score in question plays to the strength of the Sibelius 7 playback interface, which means that one size does not fit all. Certain elements such as tonal blending, super smooth legatos, and subtlety of articulation are simply beyond Sibelius's capacity. On the other hand, dynamic phrasing, contrasts of sonority, and timbral balance perform with moderate to excellent results. There are moments in these demos where I have to admit that I've heard some medium-quality orchestras play worse. It all returns to motive. Why are people purchasing Sibelius, and what are the motives in attempting to add ever more sophisticated sounds and playback systems? If composers want this new revision to be an all-in-one workshop where their notational ideas can become fully realized digital audio film cues, then they are still a few giant steps away from their goal. Though the Avid marketing department doesn't quite make this claim in promoting Sibelius, there is still the suggestion that the playback might represent a complete artistic expression on its own, and it's clear that this notion is far too optimistic. There are some fixes that could be made to the existing sounds and playback interface that could improve things further, and I welcome those improvements. But when all is said and done, this is a scoring program, not a digital audio workshop. Compared to Cubase or Logic Pro running industry-standard VSTs, of course Sibelius comes up short. Any of these sound sets can be tweaked, finessed, adjusted, and digitally massaged until the borderline between reality and sampled audio blurs. All it takes is a musician with extensive live orchestra experience who's also a master programmer and sound tech. But that's not what Sibelius is all about. The point of this improved sound set is to be a tool along the way to composing a better score and to supplement, not replace but supplement your understanding of how symphonic music works. If we can all agree that Sibelius is not a high-level orchestral sequencer, then in my view it makes this upgrade innovative, not mediocre. It can't really simulate an orchestral performance, there are just too many variables, but it can help you to check pitches, evaluate the tempo, experiment with different textures, and to listen for balance in a very rudimentary way. It can also spark your inspiration by showing you a flicker of what your music could be with a live ensemble. So my advice is to stop looking at Sibelius as the final answer for what you need to improve as a developing composer. Rather, you should see it as a very powerful tool in shaping your compositions in conjunction with your training and life experience. Let me leave you with one last thought. There are over 100 individual factors, conditions, and levels of craft between your score and a live orchestral performance. Learning how to deal with those factors is just as important as learning how to use a notation program. Any time spent turning your score into digital ear candy takes you away from learning how to deal with those very real conditions, any one of which can seriously affect the success of a premiere and possibly your future as a serious artist.